So good evening, everybody. I'm Michael Maloney. I'm the CEO of AIP, and I first of all want to welcome. It's so great to see so many people in this room. I think this is one of the largest audiences we've had since we moved into this space, and we call this space the American Center for Physics in Washington D.C. It's a space that we share with our partners, the American Physical Society and the American Association of Physics Teachers. The CEOs of both those organizations, John Bagger from APS and Beth Cunningham from APT, are here with us this evening. We want to collectively welcome you to our space here in Washington, which is a community space. It's a space that we designed for events like this where we could gather the community as we all share in our shared mission to advance the physical sciences in each of our independent ways. So for those of you who know AIP, welcome back. For those of you who may be new to AIP, just to spend a moment and reflect on the fact that we are a 95-year-old organization heading towards our centenary in 2031. And we're a federation of societies. We're an organization of organizations, and we have more than 30 societies in AIP, scientific societies and associations that in turn have hundreds of thousands of STEM professionals as their members. And those disciplines, the members span disciplines such as physics, astronomy, biophysics, bioengineering, aerospace science, acoustics, optics, photonics, rheology, chemical engineering. I could keep going because we don't try to define what the physical sciences is. We want to be inclusive. So anybody who identifies as being part of our community, we're happy to have them engage in AIP. And as a federation, we're very much focused on the success of our members, those organizations, but we're also a research institute where we carry out research not in the physical sciences, but in how the physical sciences is being done or has been done. And so we spend our time thinking about the demographics of the community, the history of the community, what linking the past and the present is the way we like to think about it, so that we can create the building blocks to shape a better future for our discipline. But because we believe in the ability of the physical sciences to shape a better world, we'd like to extend that effort to shaping a better world for the whole community. So we try to, as I said, amplify our member organizations' efforts for their members by providing our community of organizations with data-driven insights to inform decisions. We also spend a lot of time focusing on developing inclusive communities and inclusive practice, and very much focusing on identifying and then removing systemic barriers and cultural barriers to opportunity and access for every member of the community that wants to engage as a STEM professional. Our flagship program in that regard is Team Up Together, and that is also an example of where our member organizations can come together and work together on a shared outcome. Team Up Together is focused on removing systemic barriers and increasing graduation outcomes for undergraduates in physics and astronomy, with a particular focus on African Americans. And that's a project that we are jointly involved with and leading with the American Physical Society, American Association of Physics Teachers, the American Astronomical Society, and the Society of Physics Students. So as an example of the collective action that can power our missions going forward. But what brings us here together tonight is our work to preserve the history of the physical sciences, including through the work of the Niels Bohr Library and Archives. And so it's a particular pleasure in that regard to welcome you here to this evening, the Robert Oppenheimer in his own words celebration. So it makes sense, since we're talking about history, to start with a story this evening. And we'll go back long, long ago in the part. No, we'll go back to 1962, when a Belgian-American businessman and philanthropist, Danny Heineman, and some of you may know that name from the Heineman Prize in mathematical physics and in astrophysics, that we also do as a collective action with APS and AAS. But Danny Heineman provided the initial founding gift to AIP for the Niels Bohr Library and Archives. And you might question, well, why isn't it called the Danny Heineman Library and Archives? Well, Danny had a very strong sense of humility, and also he wanted understanding the deep effect that Niels Bohr had on the conduct of our science, and he was a personal friend of Danny Heinemann, he asked that the library be named as the Niels Bohr Library and Archives. And we're so proud to count the Heinemann family as supporters of AIP today. In fact, we'll be meeting with some of the Heinemann family on Friday. From its founding in New York City in 1962, the Niels Bohr Library and Archives was envisioned as a repository for the collective memory of the physical sciences, not just for storing history, but for actively sharing and shaping how we understand science and its impact. NBLA houses one of the world's most important collections of science oral histories. And with this collection, we don't just document what discoveries were made, but we also hear directly from the people who made those discoveries in their own words, as we will tonight. For 6 decades, AIP and the Niels Bohr Library and Archives, we've had the privilege of preserving and protecting a remarkable set of oral history interviews with Robert Oppenheimer, materials that until now have remained restricted from public access. And tonight, for the first time, we want to celebrate that those restrictions are being lifted. As we approach April 22nd, which is the 122nd anniversary of Robert Oppenheimer's birth, AIP is honored and humbled to have been entrusted with these historical records. And I cannot help but to reflect on Dr. Oppenheimer's own words when, at the opening of the NBLA in September 1962, he emphasized that the discoveries in science constitute what he called great epics, and that those epics must be documented and preserved and made available as part of human tradition. And so I'm deeply grateful to the Oppenheimer family for their ongoing trust in AIP as we strive to make good on his vision now more than 60 years later. We're excited to be able to host this historic event this evening, and I'm looking forward to a fantastic conversation. Before we begin, I want to extend our thanks and my personal thanks to our donors and partners and champions who support our work, including our work in history and archiving, and also the donors and partners who make events like this possible. Moderating this evening's conversation is a very trusted friend, a historian and a physicist, and a member of the AIP board, the AIP Foundation Board of Trustees, David Kaiser. David is a professor of history of science and a professor of physics at MIT, where he explores the intersection of science, society, and history, which perfectly overlaps with our mission in that regard. And he also has authored several influential books on the history of physics and science. I fully expect that tonight's panel will reflect deeply on the insights that have emerged and will continue to emerge from these newly available records from Dr. Oppenheimer's work. And also want to stress that you all are very much part of the conversation tonight, that we will welcome your comments and your questions in the latter part of the program this evening. But for now, I really want to say thank you again for joining us. Thank you for supporting AIP, and also hand over directly to David to take the conversation from here. So, David.
Thank you so much. I'm really very honored to be here, and I look forward to our discussion. My understanding from both Michael and Anna is we have 8.5 hours for this event. I think it's about right. These are very comfortable chairs. We'll be fine. We have a lot to discuss and some fascinating people that we're lucky to be able to discuss it with. So my job right now actually is to introduce the panelists. So I'm going to introduce all 3 of them at once and then invite you up. Then we'll dive right in. So on our panel, we have Kai Bird. He's the Pulitzer Prize winning historian, biographer, and journalist, renowned for works on U.S. Middle East relations, nuclear history, and political figures. Most relevant for us tonight, though certainly not the only thing we should thank Kai for. Kai co-authored the book American Prometheus with Martin Sherwin, really the biography of J. Robert Oppenheimer, that received the Pulitzer Prize and, as I'm sure you know, inspired the blockbuster movie by Christopher Nolan called Oppenheimer from not so long ago. He is the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography at the City University of New York Graduate Center. And his latest book is coming out in early September. His latest book is called American Scoundrel, Roy Cohn's Dark Journey from Joe McCarthy to Donald Trump. And that'll also be worth having a panel discussion about. So
I didn't know.
Together with Kai, we're joined by two other special guests. Charles Oppenheimer is a grandson of Robert Oppenheimer. He's an entrepreneur, an investor, a software professional, a public advocate who's written publicly about nuclear weapons policy and nonproliferation. He's involved in the Oppenheimer Project, which is a family affiliated initiative aimed at fostering discussion around nuclear risk and global security. He's given interviews and participated in panels about nuclear policy and the ethical legacy of atomic weapons. He serves as an advisor and investor in 8090 Industries, Twilio, and 200 OK Ventures. And our third panelist is Dorothy Oppenheimer Vanderford, who is a granddaughter of Robert Oppenheimer, Charles's sister. She works in information technology and emergency communications for national nuclear security programs. Originally from New Mexico, she received her English doctorate in Las Vegas, where she lives with a family. So I'll invite all three of our panelists up, and then we can start our discussion.
Are you going in the middle?
Over here. And in fact, while they come up, I'm remiss if I don't thank actually several people while they get comfortable. Thanks to Michael Maloney and Anna Lee, but also to Allison Boozer, Liz Dart, Karen, Abby Case, and really the whole team. There's a lot of folks working very hard to get this, bring it together for us tonight. Okay. So soon we'll be able to hear, literally hear, as well as read Robert Oppenheimer in his own words, as promised. I want to start by reminding you what brings us here tonight, which is these really remarkable set of three oral history interviews and the transcripts. As you can see, if you can see the small numbers, these were interviews that were recorded with Robert Oppenheimer over the course of the 1960s. Very different topics, very different themes, different interviewers, and we're going to get a little taste of each of them. And then what's so amazing is that now these are all totally accessible to all of us to explore even further on our own. We're going to take these in a little bit out of order. We're going to start actually with the middle one because that treats some of Oppenheimer's own youth and early career. So we'll walk through some of these. Before we get to the details of the interviews, though, I want to start actually with the Dorothy and Charles. Before we get to the particulars of the transcripts, I'm curious if you can share with us particular stories or themes or topics about your grandfather's experiences that you remember hearing about as children, perhaps, for example, from your father, Peter Oppenheimer. Did you grow up hearing stories about Robert Oppenheimer's early years as a physics student of the sort we'll hear about now? Or I would imagine things like Los Alamos during the war, topics like that. What help orient us as members of the family, please.
Well, so what I would say, thank you very much. Thanks for having us. Thanks to the AIP for having us. I'm grateful to be a part of this. Our We did not grow up hearing a lot of stories directly about our grandfather in our home, but growing up, and of course, Charles may have a different perspective, but it was experiential. So we grew up living in the cabin that Robert Oppenheimer owned. So we grew up living a life that reflected a life that he had experienced in some degree in his um, earlier years. So that really was the thing that was handed down to us is this is how you live.
Dorothy, you should describe the cabin.
Okay, the cabin is rustic. There's no running water. There's no electricity. And we grew up in it. And it's on a lot of acreage. It's beautiful. It's in New Mexico. It because my grandfather um, went to it and spent time there, and as with his children, then my father and mother and we lived there. It was an inspiration to him to choose Los Alamos, which is not right next to it, but geographically pretty close, as a location for that portion of the Manhattan Project. Is that sufficient, Kai?
It's a really singular place. But if you grew up there, it's very Spartan.
It's Yes, it is very Spartan. I'm trying to play it cool here, but yeah, it's right. But I was fantastic. It was I didn't do that for my children. I think they're a little upset about it. But then it was really neat. There were chickens. Anyway, I'll kind of go ahead.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean that kind of like back to the land. Robert was from New York and a city guy, and when he went out to New Mexico, he just loved it. He would sleep on the porch and ride his horse for days. Los Alamos is 2 days horse ride, and sometimes people ask us, oh, do you live there because of the Manhattan Project? And we're like, no, it's actually the other way around. That was the family refuge, and they knew the land so well, him and Frank, our great uncle, that they when scouting for the Manhattan Project, um, they'd gone to Jemez Springs, which is kind of dark, and he knew about Los Alamos and said, "Let's go up the road." Um, Related to the question, did we grow up hearing stories about his physics education? Absolutely not. My dad didn't know as much about that, and that's one thing that I would credit both the archives and the work that historians have done, because I came to read a lot about what did he study, how did he learn what he learned, and these couple of transcripts in particular are really good for that. That's the original source of him walking through, his educational experience, and I think just like any family member, we have some perspective, which is kind of familial and interesting as that happens, but it's not the same depth that you get as you read these transcripts. I feel like we're awkwardly looking in the wrong place, but to bring it back to the question.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Kai, I want to turn to you next, please. I wonder if you could just share with us a bit of what it was like working with Marty Sherwin and what became this really remarkable book, American Prometheus. As many in the room might know, Marty Sherwin had been working on Oppenheimer materials for quite a while. And I'm curious, what brought you to the project? Had you been interested in Oppenheimer or nuclear things or modern physics? Or what brought you and Marty together um, to work on this really remarkable book?
Well, we had known each other um, for a number of years. When I was in my 20s, I was a young assistant editor at The Nation magazine, and Marty Sherwin was on the editorial board and occasionally wrote uh, an essay about things atomic. And I happened to edit one of those pieces and got to know him a little bit. But he was, a senior historian. I was a 26-year-old aspiring journalist working for Victor Navasky. And but the years rolled by, and I worked on a biography and knew that Marty was working on Oppenheimer. He had signed the contract in 1980, I think. And in about 1998, after I'd finished my second biography on George Bundy, I had written about Oppenheimer in my first biography on John McCloy and in Bundy in a few pages because they were friends. So I knew the story, I knew the significance. Anyway, Marty came to me in 1998, and he'd done all this research, fantastic, and had gone to every archive. He'd accumulated 50,000 pages, including 8,000 pages of FBI documents. And we had gotten to know each other, actually, to answer your question very specifically. We were thrown together by the Enola Gay controversy in 1994, 95. That's when I really got to know Marty. He was outraged at what was happening to the Smithsonian Museum, where it was being censored in their attempt to do a 10,000 square foot, very complicated exhibit about the end of World War II and the beginning of the atomic age and Hiroshima. And it all got blown up, literally. It was censored by the American Legion and the politicians. And Marty and I attempted to defend the Smithsonian. We wrote op-eds. We formed a little historians committee to defend the Smithsonian. It was all hopeless. But working with Marty was a lot of fun. He was a very funny guy, very warm. Anyway, I'd gotten to know him in 94, 95, and then he came to me in 98 and asked me to join him on his Oppenheimer project. And I said no. I'm sorry I'm going on too long. But I said no because I told him I liked him too much. And I said that because I, knew that he had invested all these years in Oppenheimer, and I knew that biographers generally have pretty big egos. I knew I did. You have to have an ego as a biographer to take on the hubris of thinking that you can do another person's life. Anyway, I said no, and Marty kept coming back down from Boston to DC, where Sue and I were living, and he would take us out to dinner and he would woo Susan because he knew that Susan was the one who was saying absolutely never again, because I had started out on my first biography as with a collaborator and it had all gone awry. So anyway, Marty was very charming. He convinced Sue and he convinced me, and we got to work on it in 2000. And in those early months, I would get excited phone calls from Marty saying, "I've discovered another box in the attic of his Boston home, or another box in the closet filled with, interviews neatly transcribed of interviews of Oppenheimer students." And he had done all this research, and he had caught biographer's disease, which is when you know that you fear that there's something out there that, there's one more archive, one more interview. You can't start to write until you do all the research. So I broke that spell and I started writing, and that got him started writing. And it was turned into a wonderful collaboration. We went back and forth and on the chapters, and it still took 5 years to produce the book, but that's a long answer to your question.
Let me, before we turn to the transcript, one more question for Kai, and actually, I invite both Dorothy and Charles to comment on this as well. I want to ask about another more recent collaboration, Kai, and that's with Christopher Nolan on what became this really remarkable blockbuster film. When did you, Kai, first learn that Nolan was interested in making a film based on this book? And just describe at least some of the interactions you had with either Nolan or other members of the filmmaking team as the project got underway.
Well, I first heard that Nolan was interested from a little paragraph item in the Hollywood Deadline Hollywood. And I showed it to Marty, and we both worried, someone else is doing a movie about, and they haven't consulted us. And this was in 2021, and the book had come out in 2005. And in 2006, a British director, Sam Mendes, had actually bought the film option, hired a script writer, got a script written, and Hollywood was not interested. He couldn't get a producer, a studio, no one. It was. And so another party came along and for 4 years worked on it. Another script was written. They gave up. Another party came along. They bought the option. And those people actually got the book into the hands of Nolan in the spring of 21. And he read it and I think fell in love with the story. But he did not contact us. He told himself, Chris says, that he just decided he was going to sit down and see if he could write a script that did justice to the story in the book. And he spent 5 months and produced a 200+ page script, which is very long. That's a 3+ hour film. And then the next thing I knew, I got a phone call. I was in a car, I remember, here in DC, and saying, "Christopher Nolan wants to talk to you. Can he call you tomorrow at X?" And I turned to my wife, Susan, and I said, "Who's Christopher Nolan? Remind me." I'm not up on my popular history too well. And she says, "Oh, remember the Batman trilogy?" But I'd actually seen one of his first movies, Memento, which is really extraordinary, unique. It's it's all about time and space and memory. And anyway, we had a meeting after Nolan called the next day and explained that he had written a script and he wanted to have a meeting with us in New York. Unfortunately, Marty was unable to come to that meeting in Greenwich Village. He was too ill. So I took the meeting, and Nolan was very charming. He's a real intellect, half English. So we sat there for 2 hours drinking tea. And let me finish just by saying he wasn't ready at that point to share the script with me, which made me a little uneasy. But I brought along Susan, who is much more direct than I am. Eh, And she interrogated him and asked, "Well, what is not in the script? Do you have the anecdote about Oppenheimer toasting his famous deadly martinis, to the confusion of my enemies?" And Christopher laughed and said, "Well, it was in the script, but I just cut it for space." Anyway, we learned a little more about what was in the script and what was not, and I came away thinking this is great. I came back and reported to Marty that I thought maybe this was going to happen. And then 2 weeks after that meeting, Marty died. So he never saw the script or the movie. 3 months later, Nolan shared the script with me, very top secret, put me in a hotel room in Greenwich Village, and handed me this kink script. So it's hard to Xerox because it's
So it was basically Atomic Secrets, and we can just call it that.
Atomic Secrets. It was marked confidential on every page, and he handed it to me and said, "Take as long as you need. I'll be waiting downstairs." Clearly, I was going to have to give it back to him. So I spent 4 hours reading the script, and you know, a script is very different than a manuscript, a book. It's visual. It's so it was hard for me to know what I was seeing, but I thought it was good, and I could recognize whole paragraphs of dialogue that came straight out of the book. So that was very reassuring. And then 2 weeks after that, I found two errors. No, I found one error, and I had one suggestion, and we could talk about that later. But they were, the error was minor, and he was already fixing it. He had really, he had based the whole script on the book. He was very attentive to the research, and he'd done some of his own research too, which is interesting. Anyway, I saw the film eventually, of course, in Hollywood, in IMAX theater that was completely empty at 10 o'clock in the morning, and Nolan escorted me in to his favorite seat right in the middle, and then walked away to the end of the aisle and left me alone, along with his wife, Emma, to see the film solo. And it was an emotionally exhausting experience. It's just, I think it's a brilliant film cinematically. It historically, it takes some liberties. You don't know what Einstein and Oppenheimer were really saying by the pond, but it wasn't an improbable conversation. They were friends; they knew each other a bit. It was just, but it was, yeah, it was. I kept looking at it and just wondering, well, what would Marty have thought of this scene or that, and I worried also about some of the political messaging that would come out of the film with regard to Oppenheimer's understanding of how close the Japanese were to surrendering. But we'll get to that, I think. And I go on too long again. Sorry.
No, it's perfect. I think that's a great segue, in fact, to the transcripts. I'll say while I'm getting ready for the next parts. My experience was of seeing the film was rather different than all three of yours because I had no prior involvement. I had read and taught American Prometheus many times and other things in nuclear history, and I was there with my wife and my two teenage kids, and I was sworn that I would not be able to speak one word for 3 hours, sitting on my hands. This was literal physical torture for me. However, much like you say, Kai, I mean, much of the film, I felt like I knew it was coming because it was so close to documents that many of us in the room here knew so well. So there was an attention to even the sort of lines of dialogue I could recognize and even anticipate. So I used to joke it was a more strict gag order than Harry Truman's in the H-bomb. I was in real trouble if I spoke up in that theater. Anyway, but let's now move to the first of these really remarkable oral history interview transcripts that we now can all read and really enjoy and learn from. This is one, I'm going to go the 1963 one first. This is conducted by the really renowned historian and philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn. This interview was conducted as part of a massive project some people in the room will know very well, called the Sources for History of Quantum Physics, where they interviewed many, many people from the early kind of quantum revolution. And I think we can actually literally hear Oppenheimer himself tell us this part of it. Let's see if this works.
When Rutherford introduced me to Bohr, uh, he asked me what I was working on. Told him, and he said, "How's it going? I'm in difficulties." I said, "The difficulties mathematical."
It was louder. I think the others will get more clear.
I don't know. He said, "That's bad."
As you can see, he says Bohr asks, "What are you working on?" I'm having difficulties, and you can see Bohr was not impressed by the very. I should say this is from Oppenheimer's recalling his own experience as a very young graduate student, first in Britain and then eventually, of course, in Göttingen. And so he's being introduced to the leaders of the quantum revolution, and they're not very impressed, or at least he's not sure what to do. I thought that was quite remarkable. This next part, I don't think we have the audio. You can just see it here. He says, "I was still not entirely well, and I had several attacks during the year, but they became much more isolated and interfered less with work." And we might want to talk about that and what role it might or might not play in the film depiction. And he goes on to say, "I had very great misgivings about myself on all fronts, but I clearly was going to do theoretical physics if I could. I felt completely relieved of the responsibility to go back into a laboratory." That resonated with me. "I hadn't been good. I hadn't done anybody any good, and I hadn't had any fun whatever. And here was something I felt just driven to try." And I thought that was just quite remarkable to see as a young person, at least recalling later in life, trying to find his way in this still new field of quantum theory. Here's another one I think, okay, good. Again, he says a bit in the same interview with Thomas Kuhn, extensive interview about Oppenheimer's own early years as a student and now young professor. "I came back to the United States in 1929 with the apparent resolution to stay here. As for quantum mechanics," of course, he famously began teaching, and if you haven't seen yet, we have an example of some student notes from his graduate course at Berkeley around a little after this time. "As for quantum mechanics, I taught it starting essentially with wave-particle duality and the complementary nature of the experiments that you could do. I would just make the paradox as bald and inescapable as possible." Others would kind of try to paper over it. "And then take quite a long time over that and give exercises on it in order that this experience would not be buried in the formal facility with the theory." And again, I encourage you to see, and you really do see that borne out in the student notes just in the other room. Quickly, we'll come in. I want to get through these and we'll reflect on what these together can tell us. This is one I think we can, again, hear Robert Oppenheimer himself.
I think that the whole thing, it has a certain simplicity. I found myself entirely in Berkeley and almost entirely at Caltech as the only one who understood what this was all about. And the gift which my high school teacher of English had noted for explaining technical things came into action. I didn't start to make a school. I didn't start to look for students. I started really as a propagator of the theory, which I loved, about which I continued to learn more, and which was not well understood, and which was very rich.
Okay. I want to pause there and actually invite all the panel to reflect on those snippets, of course, from a very long and dense set of reflections in that prior interview. What do we make of that? And are there things that you hear here or that you had thought about and you get a new sense of on young Oppenheimer, often showing great vulnerability, great uncertainty about his own path, long before he becomes the person that we would know more about? And I'm curious, when you read these things now, or if you remember hearing similar stories before, what do they make you think about, and how do they help us change what might have been a kind of received wisdom or a too simple story from earlier? And anyone should jump in whatever you want.
Recommend. I think you can. The point of this is publishing these online, right? So it's spoken. You can hear the clips a little better online. This wasn't. You weren't able to hear his voice. The part I like is that everybody else, speaks for Oppenheimer, Woody, Kai, and Marty, and they write a book about him, but this is a direct source, and so I do recommend that, even if it's just a few minutes and read it a lot of these materials, you can see them through American Prometheus and then through the movie, and that is always worth consuming and understanding. The specific points him talking about his difficulties in experimental physics. When I was reading this transcript, that one, does point out problems he had in it, but he was really talking about this evolution of something he was finding that he really loved, which was theoretical physics, and and the quantum theory. And when they go through and describe how live that process was of, uh, explaining to each other what this quantum theory, it struck me how clear and cogent it was in his description, and me, it's just some muddled, like I don't even, pass. So I think for those in the audience with physics experience or even without it, reading the first person account of what steps they went through to make those incredible discoveries in the 20s of the quantum mechanics, it's really worth reflecting on. And yeah, I'm glad there's the public biography version that summarizes it, because you can't really get through those first materials, but I'm glad there's some of this stuff that's being published that is from the original first.
I I love that it shows, yeah, because I'm going to come at it from humanist point of view. It shows his humility, it shows his bravery, uh, and also, what do you do when you're really, really smart and everybody knows what you're talking about, and you have your own ideas, and he pursued those ideas. But again, those are themes. I mean, this certainly he was young, but we all presumably go through things when we're young, and then we mature, we learn from them. Uh, but it does show the sort of core, his ability to sort of have self awareness, reflect on himself, and then later, I think about how brave he would be after the use of the atomic bombs and then his pursuit of policy change. And there's a certain bravery in that. So uh, I have nothing to say about physics, but I can tell you the spiel.
Well, I would just agree that it's really cool to hear his voice. His voice is really magnetic and soft and hypnotizing. It's just, and he speaks in whole paragraphs. Uh, anyway, so it's great to have that firsthand source. And so I'll admit, Marty had this second transcript, the 63, yeah, by Kuhn, interviewed by Kuhn, and we quote from it in the book. We did not see, to my knowledge, we did not see the 1960 interview, and that's a regret I have, because I think that's a fascinating interview. We'll get to that, but on this excerpt here, I agree with Dorothy. It's, you get a sense of Oppenheimer, even late in life, remembering his struggles as a young man, and he's admitting to uncertainty, and also I know Charlie has a criticism of American Prometheus for its treatment of the so-called poison apple incident. And I'll be the first to admit it's a very curious anecdote story, and Marty and I struggled to sort of make sense of it. But something happened, and th- these transcripts here, he's referring to, he's not well. I wasn't well then. I had episodes. I think that's further evidence that something. Um,
The
yeah,
thing we quibbled with is
yes.
summarizing that as a attempted murder, because there's a lot
Right.
different. Like my dad would say, I think like you would have heard about that, and so
You
that
mean
that
he
was
might have
a
been indicted or something?
yes, or even an academic record. There was no record of that,
Right.
and what you guys did in the book, I thought was fair. Generally, you quote these sources of people, historians, who said he had this incident and I don't know what happened. That's what all the sources said. but it was summarized with Robert Oppenheimer had an attempted murder, and other biographers grabbed that, like what's his name, Thomas Gladwell, and said that was the only relevant fact of Robert Oppenheimer's life. He was an attempted murderer, and he got away with it because he was rich parents. So that's the thing that you deal with in biographies. There's a little, and in movies, a telescoping of like facts, but it's a relatively minor deal. And I'm screwing it up again by talking about it. We don't care that much about it, but I got to entertain the family. But it's we didn't talk about the family side of things when people make a movie out of your family. I did talk to Nolan, but we didn't get permission, and they don't ask you, and they make a story, and we're quite used to that in the Oppenheimer family. This was, that's what happens when you're associated with a famous person. But when it was a movie of this impact, it was a bigger deal. And that's just one of the things you deal with, but it never feels great when you think that something's inaccurate, and it especially that, like kind of instigation of murder. So yeah, that was the problem.
I'm going to jump in because I thought the prerequisite was everyone had to have read the book and memorized every passage. That's certainly true of many of us, I know. But who would like to summarize the so-called poisoned apple alleged incident, just to make sure we're on the same page, and then we can move on from there. Do you want to start, Charles? And then I don't want to put you on the spot, but you're trying to downplay the incident, so maybe that's unfair of you, but on you.
Yeah, there was a story that in the American Prometheus that said Robert Oppenheimer maybe attempted to murder his teacher in 1925.
No, we didn't say attempted murder. We said the story was that Oppenheimer had talked about a poisoned apple.
Yeah.
Left on the desk of his tutor.
But it was summarized in the first paragraph, and then it talks about a story of a poison apple. It's kind of a dumb thing, but he was in Corsica with his friends, and he talked about a poison apple incident, and it never had been published. They did some amazing original research with his friends from his spring break trip of 1925, and asked him about it, and they didn't know what he was talking about, and that was the question. Did he leave a poison apple on his teacher's desk, or was it a metaphor? And in the depths of American Prometheus, it says, well, we don't really know what happened. They interviewed enough people to say, I don't know what happens. But other people kind of, they read that summary that said he may have attempted murder, and so that was the part that kind of, it was hard for the family or bothered us. And then I said that in an interview, and then that blew up in our description of American Prometheus. Like, why did you put the poison apple incident in there? Yeah, me and Kai talk about it, but apparently we're talking about it in front of an audience, which is a good.
Sorry, I shouldn't have put you on the spot for that.
Biography is a mystery. It's very subjective. But Marty and I concluded that something happened. He had something in the nature of a nervous breakdown,
Definitely a
crisis. Yeah. And the poisoned apple on the tutor's desk was one incident. There were other incidents where he attacked a friend with a belt. He was in distress. And, the biographer's job is, particularly with an iconic historical figure like this, is to humanize your subject, and to not bring him down, but to humanize him and make it clear that, this was a brilliant young man, as you said, Dorothy, but who struggled in the laboratory in particular, and with his own sort of prolonged adolescence, I think we called it. He was very socially awkward and insecure at times, and yet he was able repeatedly to overcome these handicaps. And that's a story that is extremely uplifting to young people and to scientists who are grappling with all
I
this.
know you have another question. I'd like to summarize my experience. I have to presume you've seen the movie. If not, sorry. But the opening scene is the scene with the apple and the attempted murder. And the result, the effect it has on my life, is that my coworkers will no longer let me hand them an apple. I am not kidding.
That's pretty good. Oh, Dorothy, I'm so sorry. That was entertaining.
The long shadow cast. That's amazing.
Just one thing about that. I mean, that is the domain that we're talking about. Can you imagine your life so examined that 100 years from now, people are talking about not what you did on your spring break, but what you talked to your friends about doing on spring break? And that was my experience in researching Robert Oppenheimer, is that to me, it seemed like every moment of his life was explored and talked about and written about top to bottom, but it's actually not true. Somebody has so much depth of life that even if you put that much stuff in a book, we're still talking about it. And it's interesting about biographies. You read it and you know you get closer to a person's true essence, but I don't know if you ever get there.
Right.
There's
As we're learning tonight, there are still new things coming out
And
that
now
should have been in this book.
and we each get to read them and reflect and even sometimes hear them as well. Good. Let's turn briefly now to the second of the interviews I want to talk about. This is actually the first one that had been recorded with Robert Oppenheimer. It's from February 1960 with the journalist Robert Kahn. Kahn was working on an article about the end of the Second World War that appeared in the Saturday Evening Post. So a very different setting than Thomas Kuhn's very formal interview. And here we have again. Now the focus was on wartime Los Alamos and the immediate the use of the weapons and the immediate aftermath. So a very different scene than what Kuhn had focused on. And here we don't have audio, but here maybe I'll just quickly read, and hopefully folks can see the screens as well. When we went to Los Alamos, we had good reason to think that an explosion of high yield could be made with amounts of material that would be forthcoming in a couple of years, but we didn't know this. And again, that's a good reminder about walking into this frenzied but still quite uncertain time. This next part, he says, before we fired it, and he's referring now to the plutonium implosion device, the so-called Trinity test device. When we hoisted it into the tower, I asked for a receipt from General Farrell from the U.S. government for the relative number of pounds of plutonium. I'd signed for every milligram of the stuff. I was responsible for it. I wasn't going to be able to account for it. This was a terrible ritual. Can you imagine this? It had been made in micrograms and ultimately milligrams and finally kilograms. So that's how rare this material was. Immediately after the Trinity test, there was a sense of great emotion. I think General Farrell and I said to each other driving back, what became the slogan at Los Alamos for the next month or two, is now from mid-July into, perhaps into early September, and which we always drank to, that there should be no more wars. This next part really leaped out at me. I think several of us when we were reading this transcript just recently. He reflects, just after we had gotten the reports on the yield of the Trinity test, maybe around 6:30 in the morning or so, I walked out alone into the desert near base camp, and I saw a turtle about a foot wide on his back, helpless, probably knocked over by the blast wave, sort of helpless. And I turned him over. It just seemed we had done enough harm for one night. I thought that was just remarkable to see that crystallization, right? Much like the trinitite. And here we get to some things that I think are on many folks' minds, and some panels already referred to it. Remember, this was not even 15 full years since the end of the Second World War when this interview was being conducted, in February of 1960. And here he says, I thought quite remarkably in a rather unguarded way, he says, the pressures to get out of the invasion of the island of Japan were very great. We were prisoners of the view that the Japanese would not surrender without an invasion or something like this. I didn't know until much, much later that the Japanese had tried to negotiate with us through the Russian government and that the Russians had blocked that. We didn't know of the delicately poised debates in the Japanese cabinet between the war party and the peace party, and then added in parentheses, it was never our decision anyway. That was remarkable. Similar theme, he says, I'm sure that if I had then had the view of the state of the Japanese government that I have now, which may be wrong too, I would have been at the very least for a much more explicit warning. I would have tried to reduce the loss of life. And I think that I would have tried to get a negotiated peace without the use of the bomb. You could have vacated an industrial area and had a demonstration. After the Trinity test, it occurred to me that the pyrotechnic effects are not so trivial. This enormous light, that might have been enough to impress an enemy who was ready to be impressed. I'm going to pause there. Now, there's a lot in those even brief excerpts, and of course, there's a longer interview as well. We've shifted gears. We're no longer the young kind of student making his way in the world. What do you make of these reflections?
Well, of course, Robert Oppenheimer is almost most famous for his discussion about the atomic bomb afterwards, right? And he was one of those scientists who talked about it. A lot of times he's portrayed in history as somebody who regretted everything, and he was apologizing for it. Often historians who know it more, like Kai and Nolan, did a great job on this, that looked at his language, and he did not go around for apologizing for his work during the war. He said that was his duty. He did what he had to do. He didn't say, I loved making bombs and dropping it, but he did not apologize. What he thought is that it would be the end of war. And you see those notes. That's what they were working on, and they thought that there was a route to ending war. So when I read this, I hadn't read a version that where he really did say, wow, when we looked at it, if we had known what we know, we wouldn't have dropped in the bomb. So it kind of struck me. We talked about it on one of the calls, but
Yeah, I think this is a stunning quote. It's 1960. It's before Gar Alperovitz's book on the decision to use the atomic bombs, and his first volume in 65, where there's this revisionist scholarship that comes out based on Henry Stimson's diary, which has only finally had been declassified. That was the sort of key evidence that. So it makes me wonder, what had he been shown in 1960 that made him say such a thing? Was it someone like Mac Bundy who gave him copies of Stimson's diary, maybe? Or were there other memos from the War Department that had been declassified that he got access to? That's a historical mystery that I think someone should dig into. It really, and it also, these quotes validate the notion that the Japanese were indeed closer to surrendering than Oppenheimer knew in 1945. And it also validates what we hint at in American Prometheus, where we quote this speech he gives 3 months after Hiroshima in October of 45 as a speech in Philadelphia at the American Philosophical Society. And it's an amazing speech. You can hear it on YouTube, where he says explicitly that we used this weapon on an enemy that was already virtually defeated. So coming back to Nolan just for a moment, I said I had found one error in the early script, which he corrected, and also I made one suggestion. The suggestion was, I told Chris that he really ought to have a reference at least to this speech that Oppenheimer gave, where he talks about the virtually already defeated enemy. And he did add that into the script very late in the game. He got the actor Gillian Murphy to on the stage in the Los Alamos set to have the scene where he says exactly that to Edward Teller. And I thought that was really an important point in the movie, because it's just one line, but it's reflecting this.
So he says, I would have. I think I would have. I would have. In his capacity as a director, his capacity as a physicist, he would have. It's hypothetical. I mean, is he saying I would have done that if I knew ahead of time? I would have said, don't do it. He would have been willing to speak up as a scientist then in a top secret mission. I'm kind of it, they're brave statements, and he means them, and he's saying he would have. Again, it's speculative. I mean, would he have been able to say out loud to the military, don't drop this bomb, about something secret that who would he say it to?
mostly said in other places, that they didn't have the control as scientists and stuff. That's usually what he said. This was pretty interesting.
I agree. Even in one of the ones he says, in parentheses, it wasn't our decision anyway. I
Right.
think is borne out historically as well. Yeah.
Well, but on the other hand, he did participate in these meetings with Stimson
The interim committee. Yeah.
in the interim committee, and he could have weighed in more heavily on that if he had known what he had known that but in 1960. And he also knew, of course, that Szilard was passing around this petition proposing exactly this, an alternative, a demonstration of the pyrotechnics, the enormous light. So he was aware of the alternatives, but he did at the time, not knowing what he knew in 1960, at the time in 1945, he felt it was not his place.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So it's a counterfactual. It's a what if. But historians engage in those kinds of counterfactuals all the time. We had a son with you that.
So, I mean, I know we have a schedule, but I mean, is the premise that if you're a scientist discovering things and making things happen, you're also responsible for then saying, wait, that was a bad idea, or something like that. I know that's probably off topic, maybe, or maybe it's on topic, but I'm just thinking, what's the premise here? That he participated in something fully and was involved with the science, and we have a lot of people that still do that.
Well, he was a philosopher scientist. So he was, even in 1945, he was thinking about these ethical, moral questions. Now, he didn't come to this conclusion in 45, but I think it was partly because the evidence of the magic diplomatic cable intercepts that Stimson was reading was kept from him.
Correct.
And I think he may have been told by Stimson in September when he went back to D.C. about, maybe they casually talked about, he got an inkling of.
I like the way Wellerstein, the historian, summarizes this lately, where he said it was hardly even a decision. Nobody was even standing around talking about it. It was just like operations. You were in a war, you were making bombs, you were dropping them every day, and it would have been bizarrely. So it wasn't his role in the war. When he described his role in the interim committee, he was asked specifically technical questions about how to do it for the first part. The second part, the interim committee scientific panel said, what should we do with the bomb afterwards? And that's the one I often focus on August 17th, 1945, when they said, what should we do with this? And they made an incredible recommendation of how to avoid arms race and what to do with it. And that was the time. But the reason it struck me is that he mostly has many, many statements about it. And he said it wasn't up to us, and he didn't stay mostly in all the historical record that he regretted it.
Okay, let's turn briefly to the third of these now available interviews. This was done, the interview itself was conducted in November of 1966 by another colleague, Charles Weiner. Charles, by the way, was the founding director of the AIP Center for History of Physics, and then went on to found the department in which I teach, so I'm very indebted to Charles many ways over. Charles was an incredibly accomplished oral historian of physical sciences. And here what we get is Oppenheimer, the very senior elder statesperson of the field. Longtime director at this point of the Institute for Advanced Study. He's in a different place in life, and he's reflecting on different questions. And Weiner says, basically, what do you see now? How are things going? What is it like? And again, I think we can hopefully listen to Robert Oppenheimer himself here.
Spirals. It's confused. But we know more each year, and the things we know are not things that we supposed we would know. They are really rather new, fresh. And they correspond to an increased ability to describe and within limits to predict. So that I think it is a wonderful period. But most people half my age say they're too old to enjoy it.
It was shockingly hopeful. And here's the last one we'll do from these interviews, also the interview with Charlie Weiner.
It's pretty hard to beat Einstein, Vanderford, and Bohr. We're all on the scene at that time. And so if you just look with a dull eye, you think it's a much less distinguished company because it's much more diluted. But if you look with some attention to what people are doing, I think you see the opposite, namely that gifted and imaginative and technically enormously resourceful work is very much more widespread than it was 50 years ago. And I believe that it is just for a man to decide whether to rejoice or to weep about this. But he mustn't get mixed up about it. It's not the same word.
I found that remarkable. So, the last thing I want to close on before we open up for closing thoughts from the panel, and then we will have time for discussion and questions with the audience, is as many of you know, right around the time the film was going to come out, so well after American Prometheus was out, many things had changed in between. The then Secretary of the Energy of the U.S. federal government, Jennifer Granholm, Secretary Granholm, vacated the infamous 1954 finding from, at the time, the Atomic Energy Commission, which had revoked Oppenheimer's clearance. So here is a quotation from the memo from December 2022 that the 1954 atomic energy investigation had been, in the Secretary's own words, a flawed process that violated the Atomic Energy Commission's own regulations. As time has passed, more evidence has come to light of the bias and unfairness of the process that Dr. Oppenheimer was subjected to, while the evidence of his loyalty and love of country have only been further affirmed. I thought that was one we want to not miss that, since it was even a postscript, well after American Prometheus had come out. So maybe folks might want to reflect on the panel. How did this come to be, briefly, and then maybe closing thoughts on the transcript, and then we'll open up for questions. So I'm curious about this recent coda to a long-running story.
I'll summarize. It was Kai Bird's book, right? And Marty Sherwin's. It was American.
It was
Prometheus
Marty
that-
Sherwin who, after the book came out, said, let's sit down and write a memo summarizing all the outrageous tactics that were used by the Atomic Energy Commission in the trial. And so it became a 10 or 15-page memo, and we got a lawyer interested to pursue this pro bono. And
me to be the plaintiff.
yeah, I think it.
And at that time, our family reaction to people talking about our grandfather was like, "No, I don't want to be involved in it." And I asked my dad, I was like, "No, that sounds didn't become the plaintiff."
I'd forgotten that. But, well, Marty refused to give up, and he got this law firm interested, and then they assigned a young associate lawyer to research whether we could go to court to have the judgment from 1954 overturned. And about 3 or 4 months into the, quote, research, it was discovered, or came to the attention of the senior partner at this law firm, that one of their partners was the son of Boyd and Gray. Thank you. Boyd and Gray was the lawyer a senior partner at this law firm, and his father, Gordon Gray, had been the chair of
It was called the Gray Board.
the Gray Board that had convicted Oppenheimer. And so Boyd and Gray intervened and said, "No way, you're not going to use my law firm to provide pro bono services to overturn what my father's." So at that point, Marty found yet another law firm to pursue it. But in the end, the law firm in question finally came back with the advice that you can't go through the courts. Oppenheimer is dead. Everyone is dead. The only route is an executive order from the president or the energy department. So then we pursued that avenue. I mean, this started in like 2008, and it didn't happen, until 2023, 24,
December 2022.
late 22. But after it happened, the energy secretary, Jennifer Granholm, had me into her office and just to congratulate.
It was
They-
partially because she started reading the book. There was that long campaign.
Yeah.
There was a great research with this guy Narayan I don't think Narayan's here, who came up with a legal framework within the DOE that says you can't give somebody's clearance back who's dead, but you can look at the process.
Right.
I know some of the people in the DOE who were against it. And in the family, we had never really advocated for any of that. So it was scientists sometimes, and it definitely Kai Bird's impact and the book that all led to that. And it probably was not totally unrelated to the movie. But it was Jennifer Granholm herself reading the book, getting really into it. And I think the book, its most original part was that discussion of the trial. There was nothing like that in the historical record. And then that became a big subject of the movie. So a lot of people cared a lot about that, a lot of scientists.
Well, let's pause and thank our panelists, and then we'll have time for more discussion and questions. So first of all, thank you both. So we've covered a lot of ground. Of course, many things we didn't get to touch on. So the floor is open. Just I'll try to recognize. Yes, please. And then Katie. Oh, okay. Oh, thank you.
That was great. I wanted to ask you about the Vallard petition, and it's my understanding that it was generated out of Chicago. Is that right? And as I understand it, either Oppenheimer and or Truman or both didn't know about it. What's the story there? And can you talk a little bit more about it?
The Szilard petition was circulated initially in Chicago, and then Szilard came to Washington and collected more names, and Oppenheimer was indeed aware of it, and he refused to sign his name to it.
And the petition was, don't do this. Right?
The petition was, don't do this, do a demonstration. That was late
James
44.
Frank also was involved in this.
Yeah.
Very strongly.
Yeah. No, there were all sorts of famous physicists who worked on the Manhattan Project who signed the petition.
And Robert's position was at that point, or at least how he referred to it, is that he didn't think that the scientists had enough insight that the generals had. They were making the decision on the weapons. That's what I remember.
Yeah, I agree about it.
Good. I see a question on the side over here in the front.
Hello. Thank you for coming here today and also allowing us students to come here as well. I wanted to ask about kind of what we can learn from Dr. Oppenheimer and the impact of his work. It's very evident that, like, he loved what he did and he dedicated his life to what he was in pursuit of. But, history tells us that what he dedicated his life to could also lead to really, harmful events. So it's more of a broad question, but like, what would you say to, I guess, scientists now who, still had that same motivation as he did in the pursuit of, you know, wanting to do what you love, but also bearing that responsibility of like making sure that your work is not misconstrued in a way?
It's a great question. Thank you.
Well, I have a very short answer to that. I think everyone should remember if they find a turtle upside down in the desert, they should turn it back on its feet.
Great. That's a good one.
That was, that grabbed the humanity and the ethical center of Robert Oppenheimer. He was a scientist, but he was a human being who cared about suffering.
I have maybe a longer one. We started Oppenheimer Project, and my goal with that is to not just, hopefully not talk about these vagaries of the history, but what does it mean today? And I think his values and what he said about science, he said, what they did during the Manhattan Project, the discovery of that science was an organic necessity, and they did it because they had to understand how the world works, and that it's worth it, and that you need to do that as a scientist. And I think that is true, and it'll always be true, especially closer to true science that you get. And no matter what you do with that science, you have to then make the decision of how do we use it. And any tool, any development always has those characteristics. We were talking at dinner about AI. Where is it on that scope? But I think that's part of the lesson. Is it worth doing science? Is it worth discovering what happens in the world, even if you have to pay a price like he did? He paid a price during the war, and he knew it. He knew what he was doing, and he said, I have to do this in a war. It's my duty. And he did what he had to after the war, where he said, this is the right way to deal with this technology that we could create. And so I would advise any scientist to pursue that, and both parts of it, the creation of science and technology and the thinking about how to use it.
Thank you.
Good. Oh yeah, how about Nancy Greenspan and then David? Oh, okay. Then we'll work our way through across the room. Okay.
Hello, everybody. This is very interesting. The thing that's interesting is how it reflects on what's going on now with the government trying to control Anthropic. And I think the feeling of Anthropic and a lot of other technology companies is, yeah, we've developed this, but that doesn't mean that you should use it in a way that we're against. And I think it's important to understand that that's, as we go forward with AI, that's going to be a big issue. We have no guardrails, no rules right now. So someone has got to say, this is at the end of what we want to use this technology for. So I think we need to start addressing that. And I think this is a good example of that.
It's striking how different it was. They were in the position in Los Alamos where you couldn't talk to your wife about what you were working on. That was how much control the government had over science that the scientists created through an unbelievable freedom of exchange, this pure thing of science. And it was completely controlled by the government. And how different is it today? Now you have technologists creating a technology that the government has no say and no control over. Is really striking how far off things are, and it's hard to say where it'll go. I can tell you, at our dinner conversation, we didn't even get near the bottom of it.
The scientists have to sign over their rights or pledge something to the government during that period of time.
Yeah, I mean, they pledged their soul, right? You were. My grandfather went around and recruited people and said, I will bring you to this secret place. Even talking about that is a crime. And every bit of science that you're doing is for making war weapons. And you know what they said? Hell yes, I'm doing that. Sign me up. I mean, I would go fight in a war, or I'll go do it for you as a government. And it just does seem so strikingly different with, the situation with AI now, where I'd rather be a technologist creator who does have rights over my technology. I don't want to give it to the government if I have any choice, but a lot of things have changed between those times. And yeah. Yes, please, yeah.
I just want to make a cautionary note, especially about the very first slide, and that is that when people are remembering 35 years back, they don't necessarily pull up exactly what happened. And there's a slight little example in that, which said that Oppenheimer himself was saying he was the only person who understood quantum physics at that time. Well, it turns out that in 1925, another physicist who won a Nobel Prize named Max Born, who Oppenheimer received his PhD from in Göttingen, did a tour of the US. And in 26, he was in Caltech giving several lectures on quantum physics. And there were a number of people in the audience, and I have letters at home. I wrote a biography of Max Born.
A terrific
And I have letters of students who were there who were listening. And so there were many people. It could be that the freshmen that he was teaching at that time, it hadn't quite gotten down to the high school level. But in order to really make a lot of what, not only just this, but any kind of oral history be accurate, you have to go back to the primary resources of 30 years ago or 40 years ago or whatever. So that's all.
Just question, did Bourne, he didn't lecture or create it. I mean, he came and visited, right? He didn't create a school.
He didn't create a school, but he actually gave several months of lectures at MIT, and they put out the very first book on quantum physics from him. It was the first book that I think the press, yes. And then he went throughout the U.S. to lecture, and he ended up at Caltech, and
Did he teach?
Oppenheimer wasn't there at the time.
I see, yeah.
So, but Oppenheimer had been with him in Göttingen.
I'll just add a quick hallelujah as another historian in the room. Thank you, Nancy. And so one thing that, if I could also make a plug for the AIP Niels Bohr Library and Archives, it's library and archives. And what we always have to do, as of course Nancy knows so well, is we're always triangulating, right? We always have to get a variety of types of sources, which are all capturing different and often quite incomplete and fragmented things. And so combining these reflections with the sorts of things, with the letters you have, I think that's what makes it, for me, we still learn new things 100 years, 500 years, how many years after the events in question. We don't have many oral history transcripts from 500 years, but still. And so that was a wonderful, thank you. It was a wonderful example of the work and the importance of the repositories to keep these for each of us to be able to come back, say, well, I sift this, I weigh this slightly different than you. And I was, thank you, Nancy. It was marvelous.
And add them, because I spent many, many months in College Park. The whole Kuhn repository there on what he did of getting all the letters back in the 60s that came back from the 20s puts all of this together. So it's wonderful. It's a wonderful resource.
Thank you. I agree. I see.
So we have time for 2 more questions.
Okay.
This will be one of them, and
Okay.
then Zika there will be our last.
Okay, great.
Thank you. This was wonderful. I was wondering what you thought about both American Prometheus, the book, and Oppenheimer, that the film, that struck such a chord with the public. I imagine I'm not the only one in the audience who didn't expect the Oppenheimer film to become the blockbuster hit of the summer that it became. So what about Oppenheimer's life attracts the public so much to this story?
Great question. Anyone should ask about this?
I mean, it was a good subject. When I talked to Nolan, similar to you, the first reaction was like, another thing about Oppenheimer, because a lot of us read a lot of it. And so I think it's a confluence of, he was an interesting guy. Like, fundamentally, we're still debating who he was, and it was an unbelievably interesting topic. Like, the future of mankind, it was this intersection of the AI time where we were all feeling it. Do we have another existential problem? But then finally, at the end of the day, Nolan is an artist, and he did art, and he told a story that people could get into in a way. When he talked to me, he said, I'm gonna change things and dramatize it because I know how to tell a story. And I was like, that sounds fair. And with Kai Bird, I freak out if he does one nuance historical thing the way I don't like, So I guess it's expectations. He set it up in a way people could follow, and it was a surprise hit. And I guess people needed to get out of the house.
Who's Barbie?
Yeah, Barbie. Thank you. The Barbenheimer thing helped.
I want to ask a question about Oppenheimer's relationship to those physicists who he talked to who wouldn't come to Los Alamos and refused to participate. Many of them were refugees who came. I think Robbie was one who refused to participate in the development of a bomb. How did he deal with them, and what did he think, and how did they challenge his view about, as you point out, his sense of the fact that it was his duty to do this? There were people who he was very close to, very well respected, and said, no, that we don't do that.
Robbie thought that the bomb wouldn't kill enough people and that radar would be more damaging to the other side. So you just have to understand. Now, he also made that great comment about physics. Like, I don't want physics legacy, but it was effectively, I don't think that'll be a effective enough weapon as fast as we want it. So I don't know about the other people who didn't do it, but you have to understand, in World War II, we were in a war, and it was about 95% of the people who would have jumped into that war and run over to the front line, and the scientists effectively felt that way. I think that's the basic story, that they were using their tools the same way a grandmother would have been bolting bolts into a bomb that was dropping on people. That's the main part of what happened. Maybe you have a different version.
Well, I would just add that there were some scientists at Los Alamos who, in the spring of '45, expressed doubts about what they were doing. So Robert Wilson circulated a leaflet, to have a meeting inside the barbed wire, inside the secret city, on civilization and the future of the gadget. And Oppenheimer didn't stop it. He could have banned the meeting, I presume, but he instead came to the meeting and stood at the back of the room, as was his style, and let people talk, and then stepped forward and said, "Well, this discussion reminds me of the last day in 43 when Niels Bohr arrived in Los Alamos, and he asked me one question. He said, 'Robert, is it big enough? Is this bomb big enough to end all war?'" And so Oppenheimer was making a really clever argument to encourage his scientists to continue to work hard to finish the gadget because it needed to be demonstrated in this war, because otherwise the next war would be fought by adversaries, both of whom would probably be armed with these weapons. But then it's also important to understand that there was a scientist at Los Alamos who left on principle. One. Just one, I think, right? Joseph Rotblatt. And he did so as a matter of principle when he learned that the bomb was probably going to be used on Japan, not Germany.
If I might just say a couple things. One, I speculate one reason people like that the movie is such a big hit is because I think people have forgotten about the power of atomic bombs. I think there's generations that have no idea what it really means, and this movie was an opportunity for people to see in a way that they get cinematically. So that's my opinion. And I do want to say to the students um, that we all do have to make choices in life about which post we're going to hitch our horse to, and the best way for us to make those decisions is to gather as much information as possible about the variety of different perspectives on data, really look at it and develop a capacity for analysis. And that reflects my grandfather's ability to, oh wow, I can hear myself now, um, to do such a thing, to read deeply, broadly, and learn from a whole variety of sources, not just science. So if you can do that for yourself, you can be better prepared for the inevitable positions where you'll have to make a choice and you'll have to experience consequences, just, unjust. That's just life. So read broadly, deeply, and pay attention to where you're getting the information, because we were just talking about AI and you do not always know, um, you know, how truthful it is. That's what I just really wanted to answer this question.
Dorothy, thank you. It was terrific. That's a great note to end on. So I want to thank the AIP and the AIP Foundation. I especially want to thank our panelists. Okay.
Well, thank you. I like to just personally thank our esteemed panelists and our wonderful moderator for tonight. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. Another round of applause, please, for the panel. And just to conclude the evening, I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. What an insightful evening. I learned so much on this very timely discussion. And I hope that you'll take these reflections from tonight with you and continue the conversations in your own networks. This talk was recorded and will be posted on YouTube so you can um, so that you can share that with your friends and reflect and I'm sure rewind on some of these conversations. But just a quick note that tonight's programming was organized by AIP Foundation, which supports the programs of AIP through philanthropy. And so for that reason, we really want to thank the donors who make this work possible. If this type of program and this type of talk interests you or resonates with you, we invite you to continue to engage with us either by introducing our work to others, sharing about our mission, or making your own philanthropic contribution to AIP so that we can continue to do more of these conversations and dialogues that move humanity forward. So thank you again for joining us and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.